Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APACS, and welcome to the APACS Legislative Leadership Series panel on AAPI Women and the Fight for Gender Equity. Thank you for joining us today as we talk with policy experts to learn more about this issue. To get us started, I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator for today, Alvina Ye. Alvina serves as the Executive Director of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, APALA, and Institute for Asian Pacific American Leadership and Advancement. Alvina is a lifelong community organizer with experience in political, electoral, and issue-based campaigns. She is deeply passionate about building a movement where everyone has a fair shot in a thriving society. She has previously served as the Director of State Capacity Building with State Voices, working with state-based coalitions on program management, strategic planning, and organizational development. Her prior experiences include work on several campaigns at the congressional and presidential level, and serving as program director at AAPI Vote. Alvina currently serves as the co-chair of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, NCAPA, and on the board of the National Korean American Service and Education Consortium, NAKASAC Action Fund. We're so glad to have Alvina joining us today to guide us through this discussion. Before I turn it over to her, just one quick reminder. For those joining on Facebook, please put your questions in the comment section. And if you're joining the webinar, please use the Q&A chat box feature. Alvina, it's all yours.
Thank you, Madeline. Thank you for this exciting opportunity to moderate this panel full of amazing, fierce, badass advocates. I'm really excited for the conversation today. Let's get started. I'm going to start to do some quick intros of each of our panelists. Today we have with us Sherry Daniels, who's the Executive Director of Papa'olalokahi, Sue Ann Hong, President and CEO for the Center for Asian Pacific American Women, Jenilyn Soto, Senior Manager for Strategy and Policy at the National Women's Law Center, Phoebe Suba, Policy Associate at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and Kuvai Sanir, Organizing Director for the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance. So we have a really exciting group of folks. Let's begin with short introductions of yourselves and your organizations. And one thing that I'm always really interested in is, what brings you to this work? What is your personal connection for the work? For myself, I want to bring into this conversation my mother and my grandmother and all the other fierce ancestors of mine who really set a model for me of what it means to be a woman in this work and how to fight for gender equity. So, let's kick it off with, I'm going to go clockwise on my screen. Let's start with Sherry.
Evelina Maikako, everyone. Mahalo for inviting me to share space with everyone. And, as the Executive Director of Papa'olalokahi, we're the Native Hawaiian Health Board. We're one of 3 federal acts that oversees Native Hawaiian services. For our act, we are the Native Hawaiian Healthcare Improvement Act, overseeing health of Native Hawaiians, both here in Hawaii as well as across the country. And today I'm very honored to bring my kupuna, those who stepped and laid the pathway before me, but also for the next generation of Native Hawaiians so that we can continue the work that is being laid out today. So mahalo for having me.
Thank you, Sherry. Sue Ann, let's hear from you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sue Ann Hong. I'm the President and CEO for the Center for Asian Pacific American Women. 25 years ago, this organization started because we needed representation of AAPI women in decision-making tables, and we knew we needed help. When I think about my background in history, my aunt adopted me when I came to the US. She showed me the way, and she was an amazing role model, and I want to make sure that I help others coming behind us so that we have ample representation and we have communities that are thriving and that we have a wonderful future for the upcoming youth.
Thank you, and as a proud alumni of your program, I can attest to the power of that program. Jenilyn, let's hear from you.
Hi, magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, APACS, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm Jenilyn Soto. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Senior Manager of Strategy and Policy at the National Women's Law Center here in Washington, D.C. The Law Center was founded in 1972, and we are a national legal advocacy and civil rights organization championing gender justice for all in the courts, in policy, and in our communities. We work on behalf of women, girls, and gender expansive folks living, working, and learning across multiple identities and facing multiple forms of discrimination. And I am here in this work because of my family, because of my ancestors, and because given everything they've taught me and the values they've instilled in me, I don't know any other kind of work to do.
Well said, Phoebe.
Thank you. And thank you, APAC, for hosting this wonderful panel. It's great to be here. My name is Phoebe Suva. I am the Policy Associate at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, or NAPAWF. NAPAWF is the only multi-issue progressive community organizing and policy organization for Asian American Pacific Islander women and girls in the country. We focus on building power within the AAPI community to influence critical decisions that affect our lives, our families, and our communities. We have over 13 chapters across the country, all working to mobilize their own communities on the ground. We work through a reproductive justice approach in a framework, and we focus on three main issue areas: reproductive health and rights, immigrant rights, and economic justice, and of course at all the intersections of those issues. Personally, I am a Chinese adoptee, and I think it is so important when we're building power within the Asian American community to provide space for other adoptees and our experiences. We face unique barriers and things as Asian Americans. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Phoebe. And last but not least, let's hear from Kadai.
Hi all, thank you so much for having me in the space and for creating this space. My name is Kadai Tanvir. I use they, them pronouns. I work for AAPI, the National Queer Asia Pacific Islander Alliance. We are a national federation of 60 organizations throughout the country that are focused within multiple ethnicities on the advancement and just the visibility of queer and trans API folks. I personally find myself in this work because as a queer South Asian person, as a TGNC South Asian person, it is really hard to find spaces that take in all of me for who I am, and so many other people face that same issue, and it feels really important to bring together the intersectionality of being an AAPI person and also a queer and trans person, and the intersections at which those two things come together in our daily lives. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much for these intros, everyone. You know, I don't know how you are feeling, but we are obviously in the midst of several different crises. There is the pandemic, all the things that are going around racial inequity, economic crisis, you know, for Asian Americans, heightened sense of racism and discrimination. And I think even just as a woman in the workplace too, just all of the additional pressures that we deal with. And I'm really feeling a lot of that, right? And I'm also just thinking about all the ancestors and family members that you all invoked. And I just thought maybe let's just take a breath together before we continue our panel. So everyone out in the audience too, let's just close our eyes for a second and breathe in and out. So thank you all for indulging me in that. There is a lot at stake for AAPI women. And I'd love to hear, you know, let's start with Jenilyn about what you're thinking about in this moment and what you're fighting for in terms of what's at stake for women.
Thanks, Alvina. There's a lot that I'm thinking about right now in this very moment. But one of the things I'd like to start with, and if everyone will just indulge me because I'm a data wonk, I'm just going to share some numbers because I feel like numbers help to tell a really great story. So I did my best to put in this really beautiful, that I did not design, table. But if you'll just hear me out real quick, if we were in a room, I'd ask everyone, raise your hand if you've heard of the model minority myth. Raise your hand if you think that applies to you. And then we'd have like a little bit of a conversation. So The world as we know it right now has been shaped by the insidious and persistent pandemics of white supremacy and misogyny. I think many of us have had conversations around that. But then layer in a global public health crisis and the economic recession that it triggered, and we're in a real crapshoot. So, because, you know, how can people afford life-saving treatments or take the necessary time off to care for sick loved ones when they're forced to choose between a paycheck that barely makes ends meet and in a workplace that may or may not actually be enforcing any kind of protective or social distancing measures, and basic health, safety, and dignity. So this teal and white grid that I just shared, how does this apply to AAPI women? More than half of Asian, so just broad strokes, more than half of Asian non-Hispanic women, we're talking about 56.3%, reported a loss of income since March. That's compared to 45% of white non-Hispanic men and 46% of white non-Hispanic women. Asian non-Hispanic women in households with kids, we're talking about two-thirds of our households with kids, were especially more likely to report lost employment income in their household. And yet when we hear talk about who is disproportionately impacted by the economic recession triggered by COVID, do you hear them often calling us out, or calling us in rather, as like some of the people who should also be discussed in COVID relief and recovery efforts? I can tell you, I'm at a lot of these tables, I'm in a lot of these conversations, and not often do researchers, partners, reporters name us, Asian women, AAPIs, Native Hawaiians in those conversations, despite the fact that, look at these numbers. Yes, in aggregate, when you lump all of us together and we take a very skewed, misleading average, or even a skewed medium, it looks like altogether, we're doing pretty well. But when we disaggregate the data, when we disrupt the common conversations around a wage gap, it actually does disproportionately affect us. You can look at the bottom of the graph, and many of our sisters are really not doing very well. They're making barely half of a dollar to every dollar paid to white male counterparts. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in, what sector you're in, what occupation you're in. We looked at the whole, and these wage gaps persist. There might be certain industries wherein women of color, wherein AAPI women are making a little more than these averages, or excuse me, these median numbers that you see here on the slide, but the racial wage gap applies to us. It is insidious, and it is one of the tools that bad actor employers use in order to cut corners and also to silence us. So that's one of the many things at stake. That's one of the many things that I'm thinking about, that I've been working on, that many of us on this panel have been working on. And there are solutions, there are fixes to it. I'm happy to talk about it later, but I've been talking a lot right now. So I'm gonna give it back to Alvina.
Thank you, Jenalyn. Oh man, I love a good chart. Well, though that's not a good chart, that's a bad chart. And you were so real talking about sort of how white supremacy and patriarchy really is showing up and counteracting all the work and all the things that our community needs right now. I'd love to hear from Sherry and your perspective of how this is impacting Native Hawaiian women and what's at stake.
You know, I'm gonna have to really echo Jenalyn's what she talked about, and having that slide up really, I think, brought it home. So here in Hawaii, and I'll put it in the chat, but we actually worked on, through the Commission on the Status of Women, they worked on a feminist economic recovery plan. And when you look at this, it talks about, and this is based on the COVID, but when we look at it, it talks about it calls in some of the topics that Jenalyn covered. You know, not only about the livable wages, but all those other social impacts that that the economics play into how our women and our families are impacted by this. And so I gotta agree, I don't think we are talking about anything people aren't aware of. I think the difference is we're putting it on the table. We're bringing it up forward to say, you know, enough is enough. Let's talk about it. Let's put those things down so that we can have serious and real and even hard conversations about what this looks like. That no longer are we as communities going to be pushed on the side, but also as multi-genders, that we're not going to be pushed on the side, because all of our communities have that, right? And so I think we all are at a space now where we need to. This is the time, this is the moment for us to talk about it. So I'm going to echo everything that the gentleman talked about. So thank you, Alvina.
Thank you, Sherry. Kadai, would you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I also love a good graph. I love being able to read the data. And something that often comes up for me whenever I read data like this is it's segregated by so many different things, including the fact that often when we're talking about women, we are talking about LGBTQ folks, right? So when we have statistics like this, when we have data like this, how do you then put in information like 30% of the LGBTQ like folks in the US have lost their jobs? How do you navigate that while also understanding how women have lost their jobs? And what does it mean to be an LGBTQ woman? What does it mean to be a trans woman? What does it mean to be a non-binary person? How do you weigh in all of those things with the preconceived understanding that LGBTQ folks aren't likely to get jobs in the first place, let alone lose them, which they will do at higher rates? And how do we take in all that data to really support all of our folks and really bring it together to understand how our people need support, and how do we support them on multiple layers and multiple levels? How do we talk about women who are homeless right now while also talking about things like the fact that LGBTQ shelters are closing down? And how do we talk about both those things at the same time while really valuing and taking in that gender equity often means those folks that don't necessarily identify as women but have been raised as women, are impacted as women, have identify as women, are women in so many other ways that so many folks don't identify with and so many folks don't think about. So I think, yeah, it's just really, it's always amazing seeing this data and then also having to do the mental math of like, okay, well, how do I add this like information that you're giving me with the like 30% that I know in my community, and how do I add that together in comparison to like the 22% of the general population that's losing their jobs and whatnot. So yeah.
Alvina, can I just put in I think this is perfect, but what about those communities that have multiracial, that are already on the bottom of that chart, right? Many of us come from communities that make up Hawaiian, Filipino, and LGBTQ, you know, so the layers are so deep in some cases, that how do we start to kind of pull away at all those fibers of our data to really get to the information that we really want to tell our story? And when we have low reporting numbers, I'm sure even for the LGBTQ community, just getting them to report that that's already a challenge. So I think taking into all of that into account is also really critical for us.
I just really quickly,
Gentlemen, were you trying to? Yep, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to say, and on top of that, we don't even have consistent reporting from the institutions who are supposed to be helping us gather this information. So a lot of what we know about our community is also anecdotal, which is why the data that I'm showing is still, even though we've got all the different subgroups, as they like to call us, it's still lacking because they don't want to invest in the data collection for us for one reason or another.
Yeah, how many times have we heard that sample size is too small? Suan, I saw you got off mute. Would you like to chime in on this?
Yeah, so I was thinking about the data that we do have, to your point, at least with what we have today. This was right before pre-COVID with the National Partnership for Women and Families. And what's interesting is just the median data. You know, when you look at Asian American women, you're talking about over $6,000 discrepancy each year, which equates to nearly 8 additional months of childcare, 2/3 of a year tuition fees for 4 years public university, or nearly the full cost of tuition for fees for a 2-year community college, and nearly 6 additional months of rent. So when you think about, like, what I like to think very pragmatically about, what does this translate to? And to me, when I see these stats, it makes me look at the quality of life and just the ability to send your kid to college or put food on the table, and the discrepancy because it is by race. So I wanted to put that in real terms, in real life.
Great point, Sue Ann. Phoebe, do you want to weigh in on this? I know NAPOF's been doing a lot of work on the wage gap piece specifically.
Yeah, and apologies, my internet went out, so I missed most of this conversation. But yeah, for us at NAPOF, we're really appreciative to folks at like NWLC who can pull these numbers for us. But yeah, at NAPOF, we really are focused on wanting more disaggregated data and more comprehensive data to really show the real effect of this, and to make sure that no one in our community is invisibilized and erased just because of a lack of data collection.
Phoebe, the other part of the question was, what's at stake for AAPI women right now?
So much. What isn't at stake, right? But I think when we're thinking about the workplace and during the pandemic, I think a lot about sexual harassment that occurs in the workplace, especially being so pervasive in a lot of the industries that have had to remain open during the pandemic. I'm thinking of restaurant workers that are now having, restaurants are opening again, and the workers are the ones being put at risk. Meat packing and processing plants also have high rates of sexual violence and harassment. And the issue with restaurant workers is a lot of them are tipped workers, and tipped workers face different barriers because a lot of them are reliant on making those tips because they're paid sub-minimum wage. That makes it harder to report. It instills fear of retaliation. Nearly 90% of tipped women restaurant workers have experienced some sort of sexual harassment or sexual assault in the workplace, and that is a huge number. In meatpacking plants, there was a study in 2016 in Arkansas where 25% of Asian Pacific Islander respondents, largely Marshallese Americans, reported experiencing verbal and sexual harassment at work. And we know, underreporting is so prevalent, so these statistics are likely much, much higher. API women face this targeting for many reasons. We're often sexualized, and pervasive stereotypes like we're submissive or we're weak, things like that add to why we're targeted. And I think if we think about API immigrant workers in these industries, they also face a lot of fear of reporting instances because their immigration status can be held against them by managers or higher ups. Threats of ICE or deportation is really scary, and these folks are relying on these wages, even though small, to provide for their families and whatnot. So yeah, I think we also really need to think about this as we're thinking about workplaces and the pandemic.
That's so real, Phoebe. And I'm thinking of, as a fairly new mother myself, reading article after article about the impact of women leaving the workplace due to this pandemic, and the brunt that women, especially women of color, especially immigrant women, are bearing during this pandemic. Real quick, I want to pop in that we do have a question to see the data chart with participants. So, Jenna, if there's a link you want to drop in the chat, please do that. But let's talk about it. How are women bearing the brunt of this pandemic? And what are some policy demands and needs that we should be thinking about and talking about in this moment? And anyone feel free to jump in here. I can start calling names too. All right, Sherry, you've got a great smile on right now, so I'm going to pop it over to you.
Oh my goodness. I think during this pandemic, we see women are often covering, it's not just the brunt of the work, but they're also homeschooling their children, right? We know that many states that are having distance learning at home, those moms are often juggling. If they're working remotely from home for work, they're doing that, but they're also trying to manage the household in a very different way. a way of helping to educate their children. And, you know, if I look here in Hawaii, and I'm sure it's across the country, if you have multiple children in multiple grades, maybe in elementary, middle, and high school, that's already stretching you in terms of the capacity to manage time, but also still do the work, right? So I think there's some of that. We know that women that may be involved in domestic violence situations, that we see are becoming an increased concern in communities because of all the added stress that plays a role in that. I think there is a belief that women tend to hold everything together, which we know we do, we multitask. But what that does is it creates this unrealistic sense of more responsibility on the person and increases their burden. And so I think when we look at how, you know, women are bearing the brunt of it, it's just not in the tangible economics of it. It's all of these kind of social kind of environments that have the impact to that. And so I don't think at this point we even are seeing the tip of the iceberg on how that's going to play out for especially for women, but also our AANHPI women. What is that going to look like when you know, the economics and tourism shifts here in Hawaii, all of those lost wages, those lost jobs, and especially for women in communities that's all they've done is hotel or tourism industry work as housekeepers or front desk. How do we help them figure out their next chapter, right? What other employment opportunities are there for them? So I think there are still pieces of this pandemic that will still roll out, and we don't even, I think, understand the full brunt of it at this point.
Sherry, to your point, there was a study done in England where they found that 3,500 families surveyed, a mother has an average, by the way, both mom and dad working, average of 1 hour of uninterrupted work time per day versus 3 hours for a man. So she's taking on all of the chores, she's taking on all of the, you know, the remote learning, right, for their children and all of that. So literally I put that into having like maybe a meal on the run and maybe taking a bio break, because at the end of the day, that's all you have, right? And what are you doing in order to then, you know, be the wage earner, but also you have no time to do anything except take care of everybody else.
So chiming in as a data person, but to my point earlier about, oh, people don't fund data collecting initiatives for our communities because the sample sizes are too small. Well, I work for an organization that is privileged enough to say, well, F that, we're just going to fund our own data collection. So one of the things that I do at my role, or within my role at the National Women's Law Center, is I run our Pathway to Gender Justice initiative, which is a policy organizing and community engagement effort that we launched last year that seeks to build an inclusive society by centering women, girls, and gender expansive folks in the ramp up to the election and beyond, before COVID became, you know, our reality. And to do that, we're going really deeply with some of our longtime partners in battleground states like Michigan, Nevada, South Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi. And one of the things we like to do there is issue polls, collect opinions, get people to pay attention to the fact that our communities vote. Women, young women, LGBTQ folks, gender non-binary folks. I've got data for you on gender expansive folks in South Carolina. I've also got data for you on women of color voters in Michigan and how they've been impacted by COVID. It's not AAPI specific, but guess what? I was able to work with our pollsters to say, we know that there are pockets of Latinx folks, Asian American and Pacific Islander folks, and Middle Eastern and North African folks in Michigan. So we better also be collecting their data too, because we're trying to mobilize everyone who's high potential during this really critical time. And how they came back to us and said, you know, this is how we're coping with COVID. 8 out of 10 women of color voters in Michigan have been impacted by COVID. And that, I mean, now everyone's on the 200,000 number of the devastating 200,000 COVID-related deaths here in the US. But before everyone had that number in their minds, the prevailing misconception around COVID is it's not really affecting us. It's not really a thing for us. And yet we had been talking to ourselves, with our community members, with our neighbors, to the press about, no, Black and brown folks, especially AAPI folks who are disproportionately overrepresented in all of these frontline jobs, and also disproportionately overrepresented in the disparate comorbidities. We have lots of stories to tell you. Here are the receipts. 8 out of 10 of us, we've been affected financially, in terms of our actual health, in terms of people having to quit their jobs, predominantly women having to quit their jobs in order to provide homeschooling and caregiving to both children and others within their family. We're talking about people who have been furloughed. We're talking about business owners who have had to, who've had their businesses impacted. And my favorite, my absolute favorite, women who have experienced workplace issues and comments about their ability to juggle at full capacity their work portfolios and caregiving. Because, caregiving is both the underpaid, undervalued, but primary thing placed upon those to whom are ascribed a certain identity, and also an actual industry that is disproportionately run by, staffed by Black and brown women. Like, it's wild.
Yeah, I think that's real. And as someone who has used your website many a time to look up statistics, I appreciate you being able to provide these so-called receipts, because I know for many a time we knew anecdotally what was going on in our communities. We didn't have the data to back that up. Kudai, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I was going to say, I really appreciate bringing in things like narratives and qualifying stories as forms of data, because it feels so important to really note those things as we try to build policy, build organizing, build structures around it. Some of the things that we talk about the most is, in this moment, acknowledging that only 51% of the folks in the US who identify as queer or trans have come out to their families, meaning that there's 49% of people, some of whom are having to go back into the closet, into their homes, losing their jobs, doing all of these things while also having to navigate being women, being non-binary folks, having to caretake for their families, having to do all of that while being in the closet, while having their identities brushed aside, and just trying to navigate existing. And sometimes, because we don't have numbers necessarily for those things, the stories also get brushed aside, and then no one talks about how things like not coming out, not having the acceptance of your family leads to homelessness, leads to job loss, leads to death, leads to all of these things that feel so important that there is data for, but because we aren't bringing in that the qualifying stories, we don't actually get the full analysis of why is this happening? Why is this important? What does this have to do with LGBTQ folks? And what does this have to do with the data? So I really appreciate you bringing that in.
I'll jump in. As you know, we're talking about women having to leave the workforce, and also because of the pandemic, losing their jobs. Something that we really think about at NAPOF is how this impacts their access to reproductive health care. So abortion services and contraception. API women and women of color already face huge barriers to accessing this kind of health care. And this pandemic and job loss is just another thing that exacerbates that. Imagine being someone considering having children, or was in the beginning stages of pregnancy, and then all of a sudden you lose your job, or you're forced to leave your job because of the pandemic. That changes your entire situation, right? It changes your options to parent and to raise a family. You lose your financial support, and you're also losing healthcare coverage to pay for contraception and abortion services. There's a study by Guttmacher, actually, that looked at the impacts of COVID-19 on reproductive health experiences among women of color. And unfortunately, they didn't include API folks in that, but it did show that women who are already experiencing systemic health and social inequities are reported the greatest change in fertility preferences because of the pandemic. So Black and Hispanic women were more likely than white women to state that because of the pandemic, they wanted to have fewer children or wanted to have children later. And lower income women reported similar things, wanting to wait a little bit longer. So I think this pandemic, it also shows, access to reproductive health care has just become much, much harder. And we have states during the pandemic using abortion to say it's not essential health care, putting in abortion bans. So just hurdle after hurdle for women to receive this kind of treatment.
I echo a lot of what has already been said. At Apollo, we've been doing a lot around uplifting AAPI essential workers and the stories of what's been impacting them. I'll drop a link in the chat for some of the videos and stories that we've been producing to sort of highlight some of the challenges workers have been facing. We also just recently put out worksheet or fact sheets on workplace safety, and we've been trying to get the funding to translate them into different AAPI languages to make sure that our members who are most impacted, who might be monolingual, can get that information. And I'll drop a link in the chat for that too. But that said, I know all of you are working on some really amazing things right now. What would you say is one of the top, 3-4 policy demands that you have for this moment? How do we address all of these issues that you all have been bringing up?
I like to wait 7 seconds, but I'm also willing to go first.
I think the mic is yours.
Cool. So I will name the pall the other pall hanging about, and that is with the passing of the glorious and notorious Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We are not only dealing with one of the most pivotal elections in our lifetime, in recent history, we're also dealing with an unprecedented brinksmanship ramming of a SCOTUS, a Supreme Court of the United States. SCOTUS, we really love acronyms here in Washington, D.C. We make an acronym for everything. Nomination and confirmation fight during an election. The election is not on November 3rd. The election is happening right now. Early voting has already begun for millions of Americans. And so right now, many of us, some of us here on this panel, many of us in the national sphere and in states all across the country, especially in those states where there's a competitive Senate race, are getting really activated around their rage, around our rage, to fight for not only the legacy of RBG, and oh my God, I'm gonna get a little teary, but also for what the Supreme Court actually means for every single person on this call, on this Zoom, on this Facebook Live. So I realize, and trust me, it took me a few years into my career to recognize the importance of the Supreme Court, of the judiciary, that it's not always the most easy to understand system. So I'm just gonna quickly run through just a little bit why it's so important that you not only register to vote, register your friends and your family and every single neighbor of yours to vote, and educate them as to how and why the vote is important, and hopefully get them to vote for the best interests of our community, but also why the Supreme Court really matters. So again, it sounds like it's super far removed from our daily lives, but it has deep impacts on how we are governed now and into the future. It's not just the next 4 years, it's the next 5 decades, because some of these people live real long lives, and these are lifetime appointments. Come on, RBG fought through numerous bouts of cancer to keep us safe. And she shouldn't have had to, but that's her. So who and how someone qualifies for citizenship, the legalities of race-based internment, The interracial relationships, should they be? Yes, they should. Same-sex marriage, yes, definitely a thing. Your right to affordable and accessible healthcare, your right to affordable housing, your right as a woman to have your own credit card, lease your own apartment, have your own house, have a credit history, play sports, your right as a gender non-conforming person to exist, to be, to love, to learn, to work, your right to choose what happens to your body and when. These are so many of the things that have been decided and are being decided by the Supreme Court. And so everything that you have possibly thought of, immigration, that is a huge part of not only the election, but also defending the legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of Justice Ginsburg, and the SCOTUS nomination fight ahead. So I don't like to be defeatist. I like to channel my rage into doing something proactive. Sometimes that proactive thing could be reactionary, but I definitely encourage you to get involved in the fight. I'll drop my email down in the comments if you want to learn more about what you can do to push the Senate to do what's right.
Sue-Ann.
Jenna, I love your passion. I'm going to call it passion. So I'm going to dovetail off of what you're talking about from an early vote perspective and talk about the U.S. Census. And I had the pleasure actually of, we did a video about the census, and Sherry was part of that, but the amount of money at stake for our communities, we need to be counted. You know, the whole thing about being counted, being seen, being heard, that is one way that we can get that money that we need for our communities, especially with all of the conversation we just had about salary disparity. They need support in our schools, our hospitals. Over 100 programs are funded by the census. This impacts us for 10 years, and it takes 10 minutes to do this. So I know that there's a lot of fears around the census. I know there can be controversy around that, but at the end of the day, we need that support. We need that for our communities and our families.
Phoebe?
Yeah, I think Jenna summed up very, very well about why we need to get out the vote and do that. NAPOF actually just released a report called Mighty Voices, Asian American and Pacific Islander Women Voters in 2020. And this report draws on public opinion research and experience from staff at NAPOF and volunteers who were involved in our voter engagement program. They describe, what they've learned about API women voters, and they share our recommendations for how to mobilize our communities. And some of the interesting things we found is API women are really motivated and care about the issues that we've all talked about today, about autonomy, about equal pay, about making sure that we can thrive and live with dignity in our communities. 93% of API women voters in our study said that a woman being able to control if, when, and how she has a child provides benefits to both individuals and our society at large. Our research also showed that API women understand that many parts of our identity contribute to the experiences that we have. The top 4 issues that they said were important for Congress to address and to make progress on were ensuring access to clean water, ending racial and ethnic and cultural discrimination, ensuring everyone has access to affordable health care, and passing common sense gun laws. So I think all of these issues really speak to API women and their understanding about the importance of having bodily autonomy. And all of that is at stake with the Supreme Court vacancy.
I think in these moments when we are also importantly focused on voting and making sure that folks vote, it always feels marginal to bring up the other things that are happening in the world, like keeping in mind that in all of these conversations and all of these discussions, there are smaller bills and smaller things that are happening that's still impacting folks really deeply and intensely. And with that, just like reminding folks that yes, get out to vote, yes, do all of these things. And also keep in mind that many of us are getting our rights taken away in this moment as well. For example, the anti-HUD trans bill just recently, the comment period ended 2 days ago. This bill allows, this rule allows that if it were to be passed, it is basically on good faith that folks that run homeless shelters can deny people access into shelters based on what they consider on good faith a feminine feature or a masculine feature, etc. Right? So things like this deeply impact not just trans women and non-binary folks, but also just women in general. How many of us look the same at all? How many of us want to be identified in any capacity with what a random person is going to think we look like on a specific day, and whether or not in that moment they get to decide whether we get access to homeless shelters? So just really keeping in things like that, and things like the Equality Act, which is currently sitting in Senate, and the fact that so many of our folks are losing their jobs through COVID, but also if they weren't losing their jobs in 30 states, they could still lose their job just for being queer and trans, and just really keeping those things in mind as we push folks to go out and vote and to really figure out what's going to happen in the next 4 years for us.
You know, I want to just, I think, maybe bring everything together, that there are multiple threads that we're focusing on, whether it's on the national level, whether it's state level, whether it's county level, local level. There is so much going on that at the end of the day, I think it's really important for us to create the ally networks, create those almost those supportive networks with our organizations, with ourselves, with our communities, because we need a village to move forward. Just like how we need a village to raise our families, we need a village to do these pieces and have people take on those responsibilities, those kuleana, to lift, to awamo that kuleana up, because I might need my contacts in DC to help push on the national, things that I can't do all the way in Hawaii, 6,000 miles away. But in Hawaii, how do we bring those people in the state to advocate strong, and people on the islands? Each island is its own county, right? So how do we create those tiers of support that our community is going to need? Because all our communities look different. We are not cookie cutter in any way, shape, or form. And I think sometimes it's very easy for us to just go, oh, somebody's got it for me up in DC. No, we cannot assume or become complacent. And maybe that's the piece, is how do we continue to not just allow and to not be complacent, but to almost ask, and in some cases be passionate. But right, so I think that's really important, that there are multiple levels that we gotta be aware of and mindful about and educated about, because if we're not, and we're just letting things go around us, then we're going to be left behind when the train starts moving off of the station. So.
Thank you for all of that. Just thinking about everything that you all are holding, all of your organizations are holding, someone mentioned earlier, multitasking, which I think is a fallacy, but we're all holding on to a lot right now. And I don't really know that anyone's really taken a real break to just rest and rejuvenate and build up your resiliency during this pandemic, because we felt like so much is at stake, right? But how are you all leading through this pandemic, whether that's through your organizations or your personal leadership? How are you thinking about resiliency and leadership in this moment?
I think for me, leading through this pandemic really means leading with compassion. I think we are all going through a tremendous amount of loss. The pandemic has caused, so many issues to our day-to-day lives. We're all adapting and changing. So I think when we're thinking about this work, yes, there's so much at stake. And because of that, this work we have to be in this for the long haul. So I think we need to really take care of ourselves and rest when we can, be in community with each other, because in order to be resilient in this movement, we can't afford to burn out. And I think that this administration especially would love to see us all burn out and want to walk away from this movement, and we can't give that to them. So I think really taking care of ourselves and making space for what we need is really important as we do this work.
You know, I think for myself and our organization and our communities, it's we're starting to really recognize the cracks in the status quo. Um, you know, that I think the pandemic is starting to highlight really what leadership is, not only within our communities, but around us that impacts our communities. That even though we know to actually see it kind of play out in front of us during this pandemic. And so now it almost puts the onus on our communities to say, okay, we see it, it's right there in front of us. How do we change it? How do we do different? If we're going to advocate for ourselves in a way that we're not going to accept the status quo anymore, then what are we going to do to change it? And I think from our communities as Native Hawaiians, we're starting to see this not accepting that norm, to actually start to really re-examine what it means culturally to be. What space does it mean? What truth does it be in terms of being Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, right? That we have a voice, that we can talk, that we actually understand, and that we can actually drive in the lane. And so I think recognizing the lanes that we all occupy, not to say that we don't want to have allies and help each other. We definitely do. We need that unified voice, but we need to recognize that it's okay that a community finds their voice, and our role is to help them, you know, amplify that voice, but that we don't have to be everything for everyone. And I think that's really starting to be much more recognized in what this pandemic has brought to light. So I think that's really important, understanding our role, understanding the place your culture has, and standing in that truth, regardless of what others understand it to be. So, you know, I think that's really important. And I think that does play into how you self-care during the pandemic, is recognizing that I don't have to conform to the box because that's what's required of me, that I have this other box. And you know what? I can actually bridge both, and I can be a very contemporary Native Hawaiian woman in this very Western world. And how do I do that? And how do I set that pathway forward? So I think the pandemic is pushing people's, their own personal limits during this time. But I think it's also showing us what true leadership is. And true leadership, I think, creates the resiliency. All of us have historical trauma, right? Our communities have historical trauma. We have as people. So I think it's recognizing, accepting, and standing in that truth, and not being apologetic about it anymore. So I that's my mana'o to the bowl, I guess, to the table that I bring. So
I think that is so powerful. And I'm thinking about some of the most effective organizing campaigns I've seen have been unapologetic in the representation of our communities and the culture that we bring into that space. And I'm thinking about, you know, spaces I've seen that bring in like joy and beauty and art and dance, and weaving that into how we tell the story about the work that we need to do. So that all really resonates with me. Suman, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that I'm looking at a group of women right here that are doing incredible work. So this network of women that I'm continuing to see, and all the work that all of you are doing, that makes me feel very energized, because I know I'm not alone, which was why KAPA was created in the first place, is so that we wouldn't be alone. You know, that we have a network of women, and we call ourselves the Warrior Sisters for that reason, because we are doing warrior work. And the second thing I would say is that it really made me focus on what's the most important, because I feel like I knew that before, but I think I'm laser focused now on my purpose and what I'm supposed to do to help, and what's my part in this greater, you know, what we have to do to help community. And I think that's one of the things that I realize, is that I have to continue to uplift other women. And that's part of my job, is part of my purpose. And how do I do that? And how widely can we cast that net so that women are in that position of power and influence, so they can help change policy, they can bring more of their leadership into the forefront. And three, I'm going to say, you know, part of this work is, it can get kind of lonely right now. So I am learning how to ask for help. And that's something that I wasn't very good at, honestly. But I think now, through the pandemic, I mean, I could probably sit here for 7 days and not talk to anyone outside of Zoom, you know. And I think just having that, reaching out to people and say, hey, I just need to, you know, have a connection, and just feeling, and part of that compassion that Phoebe was talking about for yourself and being okay with having a need. I think that's what I'm learning as well.
Yeah, that is so true. One thing I've been working on is just asking for things and not feeling like it's selfish or greedy to ask. Could I?
Yeah, I was just going to echo off of that. I think one of the biggest things that I've seen our community do is build bridges during this time, as hard as it is, as like exhausting as it is on the day to day. I've watched folks like really intentionally lay down the pieces of wood needed to build with other folks, because in this moment all of us are taking deep breaths before we approach any new work, while like battling old work, while trying to exist in a completely new way and still hold our families, hold our people upright. And I think that's been a really immense moment of resilience and power for me, has been watching and being part of that bridge building, whether it's with other women, whether it's with queer and trans folks, whether it's with Black folks, making sure that we're showing up for them consistently and actively. But just watching so many of those bridges get built with so much intentionality. And I know it comes from a place of sheer exhaustion. We're doing it so intentionally because otherwise we might drop these bricks, but it feels really good to watch those things come together with such a strong base.
That's super powerful. For me, resilience and leadership during this time might, like if you had asked me this question even a couple of months ago, my response would be way different. But I'm one of those immunocompromised people who can't just like go out and interact or go and show up or like every trip to the grocery store like a block away is terrifying. So I got some real scary reminders about what resiliency actually looks like if you don't take care of yourself and when you do take care of yourself. And so advocating for one's boundaries and recognizing the signs, I think everything starts with yourself, which I know is not like community oriented and like super inspiring, but I'm definitely in a probably need to look at myself first mentality right now, because how can I be a resilient leader or a resilient ally or a resilient co-conspirator if I'm like in the ER every 2 months, you know? But that's been one big lesson, is really paying attention to my physical and emotional and mental boundaries. And then the question that has been most helpful for me during this time is, where is this coming from? When I feel myself reacting a certain way or thinking a certain way, interrogating that for myself, like, where is this coming from? Or when someone else that I am building a relationship with or in a relationship with is reacting a certain way or like processing a certain way, asking myself to take that moment to go, where is this coming from? So that we can, as Phoebe was saying, do the things, do the interact with that compassion, because we also need to be compassionate with ourselves.
Yeah, that is really, really beautiful. And I think as women, and I know in my family culturally, like setting your own boundaries too is just not something, like I had to learn what that word meant, and I have to still practice that, right? It's still a challenge for me, so that's very real. One thing you said, Kudai, is a really great segue into a question that we have around how, you talked about the bridge building, like how do you be intentional with that bridge building? How do you be a good co-conspirator, a good ally? And what does that look like for each of your organizations?
I love this question because the answer is taking a deep breath and being okay with the anger. I think a lot of us work in communities and in specific pieces of data or information or policy, or just like with specific communities where it feels like, oh, like this is so obvious. Why don't you know this? And having to take a really deep breath and be like, it's okay that you don't know this. You can probably teach me something I don't know. And yeah, I think that's the biggest way that I know Incapia has been able to build relationships with folks, is just really being able to be like, it's okay. If you are willing to learn, we are willing to sit down, talk it through, teach, also learn from you. There are plenty of things we don't know. And I think that was that has been and continues to be both a humbling and also really powerful experience of exchanging realities.
Sherry, do you have other thoughts on this? I know in one of your remarks you were talking too about setting boundaries with allies, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this piece.
Well, I think I got a new buzzword. I think I'm gonna go with co-conspirators. I like that. There's a sense of like intrigue and right. I mean, there's like I go back to, this is really, if we think about it, it's a game, right? It's a game of outwitting, outmaneuvering something. And so I like that co-conspirators. I'm gonna cockroach that. But I do agree that it's taking the deep breath. I think going in without, we all have preconceived notions, right, of things. Whether we're used to taking the lead, whether we're used to being the experts in an area, I do think that you got to put aside the egos, and recognize that egos may still come to the table, but being really clear in what the intentions are. I think a lot of our kupuna, our elders, have talked about, when your intentions are good, when your intentions come from a place of pono, of good, maybe hard work to get to that goal, but you're going to get there. And I think it's okay to be clear in what those intentions are, be clear in what our goal is, and recognize that the journey I take to get there is going to look different from Sue-Ann or maybe Phoebe. But if we continually have conversations about what that's going to look like, we can recognize that we're going to take, I'm going to take the train. Sue-Ann might drive there. We might go around the bend to get to where we need to go, but it's okay. That's the journey that we have to get. I think we feel more pressure now because it seems like time is encrunched, right? We don't know when this is going to end. We got this, very short window, and we need to activate. And I think that's the challenge, is how do we do more in such a crunch time without getting upset, without feeling all these other emotions. And I think really it's important to avoid being divisive. I think in our communities, it's very easy to get sucked into, well, our community here doesn't get as much as your community there. And we all could be from the same AANHPI communities, but there's always that you have less than I. And I don't think that's really our intention, but that's what we've been raised to believe in terms of how we play the game. Not in our culture, how we play the game, right? Because we've been kind of taught that in order to get resources, we gotta behave and produce a certain way. And so I think it's easy for us to divide in our communities, and we cannot do that during this time. We really gotta figure out how to stick together even when around us is becoming divisive, right? We gotta really stick together, and I think that's where the hard conversations come. And when we remove the egos at the beginning, it's a lot easier to have those harder conversations, and really make it not about me. I think none of our communities are individualistic, right? We never were raised thinking it's all about me. I mean, I was raised that I am part of a community, and the community's thriving happens because I put in the work to help my community thrive. And so I think those basic concepts we learned as children, as from our elders, our kupuna, those are the things that should be guiding us as well. And so going back, right, we already had it in our history. Why are we not looking back and taking those nuggets or those pearls of wisdom and applying it to what we're experiencing now? Because that's not what we've had to do. So the game has shifted. But you know what, as resilient communities and as resilient people, we can shift easily. I mean, my community, we traveled across vast oceans to get to where we are. I think we know the meaning of resiliency. We've had colonization, we know resiliency. So I think we just gotta tap into that, which is already in us.
That's really great. One thing you did say was something about like, how can we do more? And I do want to push back on that piece a little bit, because I think that's the fallacy of like white supremacy workplace culture, is that we should be doing more. And one thing that I learned in my AAPI leadership program is just the concept of enough. And I think about that a lot, and I think about what enough means, especially as we're trying to be resilient, especially as we're trying to draw upon our personal power in this time, to not push to be everything to everyone, and not to push to produce more for the sake of producing more, but understanding what's enough for the moment, and for the people in the community that we're in. All right, I will get off my soapbox on that. One great question, and I think about this too, I think it also ties into the resiliency piece, is there's a great question someone posed about mentorship, and where are there mentorship opportunities for young women? How are you mentoring? Give me your 30-second speed round on mentorship.
I'll start. I think, the way I look at it is there are so many people in need. All you have to do is turn around and look, and you can find people to help. And so today was a perfect example. Like I always try to have an opportunity to, because young people are important to me and up and coming, and AAPI and AA and HPI women especially, because we still have struggles in terms of getting where they need to be, the support that they need. And so I try to be deliberate about mentorship. I try to, number one, find out what the need is of that individual, and then try to see if I can match that person with someone that would be great for that. And it could be a very mutual type of a relationship where they learn from each other. But I think part of what I'm learning is that sometimes Asian women don't have even time to think about a mentor. Honestly, I asked this question to a group of circle of women. I said, what do you need? And they all looked at me like with a blank stare of, they couldn't even tell me what they needed because they hadn't had time to think about it. And mentor is probably a great way to explore that. So that's one way that I talk about mentorship. And as far as for group mentoring as a coach, I also have opportunity to mentor Gen Y, young millennials, and especially around career. And especially with AAPIs, I think that's one of the groups that they need some additional assistance sometimes to be more methodical about their development, to be more methodical about skill sets and identifying what is needed. So those are a couple of ways that I contribute for mentoring. And then I have mentors too, for me, because I need some perspective that's different. I have mentors who are, in executive office, and then I have mentors who are, out of college, because I think they have a very different perspective, and then all different races. So that's what, I mean, it's a big topic, but those are some examples.
I want to gold star something that Sue-Ann said, which is that mentorship is a mutual relationship. It's a two-way street. It was one of the most important things that I learned in college, is that you can learn from anyone and everyone around you. You might be the one who's like titularly or on paper, the one who seems to have everything, all the answers, but that's actually not the case, because reality is a whirlpool of various things. The people who know me know that I was substituting a different word in my mind. But one thing, it's so hard to land on and identify, and some people struggle with the word need. Because if you straight up ask me right now, if my partner walked in, and he often walks in and asks, what do you need of me? I look at him and I'm like, so many things. It can just start with, what do you want from life? What is it you're like, what keeps you up at night? What gets you up in the morning? Even if it's just your alarm clock, even like there's something there though, and it's a conversation. Mentorship isn't just you sit down to coffee with someone or on a Zoom with someone and suddenly all of the right questions are being asked and answered. It's definitely a process, and there's mentorship. There's also finding people within the world who can be a role model, because mentorship doesn't always have to be a strict relationship. It could be someone who's giving some kind of advice or like modeling the things that you want to know and do and learn in the world. I have like a texting relationship with Brittany Packnett? No. Do I consider her a mentor? Yes, because I've been in the room with her like 3 times and I follow her Instagram and her Twitter, and she just like helps keep me on the track and like recognizing my own self. And then I've got people who are sponsors, not just mentors. And I know sponsor is a weird word too for some people, but it means someone who's like willing to show up and speak my name when opportunity is in front of them, is in the room, or they've like heard the whisper of an opportunity. That's another relationship that you can look for, because mentorship doesn't just have to be like, this is my professional development plan. I am 32 years old and I'm still working on my professional development plan. I'm also like one of the most type A people you will ever meet. I've got like Google documents and lists and bullet points and tables on all the things. I did 1, 3, 5 year, 7, 10 year plans. COVID happened, a lot of different things happened. Trump, just know that as long as you're starting to ask these questions, you can get there. But a mentorship is not something where one person is going to answer your question. As Sue-Ann said, it's like a board of directors. It is all of these different people who've got different experiences who can help you ask the right questions or land on them on the right topics when you need them, when you want them, when they're right for you.
All right, there are a couple of questions in the queue. Does anyone have a burning thought on mentorship before I move it along?
I do. Quick thought. I really like that you said board of directors, because I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think something that we don't think about with mentorship is that it doesn't need to be one person for everything in your career. It can be so many different people for so many select and specific things, and that it's a long-term relationship for a very, very, very long time. It's not a 1 year or 2 year position. It is a forever budding relationship. That's all.
Great. Okay, so I actually think maybe I'm going to try to merge this into one final thing. Is let's go around and give everyone a minute to just give us some closing thoughts. And if in your closing thoughts you can share, I know it's really hard to distill this down, but like one demand, one takeaway that you want people to walk away with. And the questions I'm trying to weave into this is, someone is asking if there are any resolutions or policies that advocate for various gender equity platforms. And I know, Kudai, you'd mentioned the Equality Act, if you want to weave that in, or if anyone wants to chat any of those answers in. And then also there's another question about what we can do to ameliorate some of the effects of RBG's death with regards to future policy. And I know, Jenna Lynn, there's a huge campaign around the courts and pushing senators right now. So hold those two pieces, if you can, into your closing remarks, and just leave us with, what can be done at this moment. What's the one thing that you want to leave folks with?
Okay, I'm gonna come out of the gate. Stand in your truth. Stand in your truth. Whether that truth is not in agreement with the larger sector of your community, but that's your truth. Stand in your truth. And I think that's hard. It's easier said than done, but maybe that's the start of the conversation that you need to have internally. But stand in your truth. Don't be apologetic about it either. So I think that covers both my questions.
Perfect, thank you. Phoebe.
Yeah, I want to echo that. Standing in our truth is so important. And I think, we've discussed so many ways, very many facets of our identities as API women. And I think when we're thinking about policy and, what needs to happen, I think no matter the policy, we need to make sure these policies are intersectional and focus on all parts of our identities, and do the most for the most amount of people.
I can go next. I dropped my email in the chat. It's jsotto@nwlc.org. If you want to learn more about the Our Court Coalition and fight to prevent the stealing of RBG's legacy and this election, I'm happy to send more information over to you. And as I think something that Kudai mentioned earlier that's really important is that there are so many ways for us to disrupt bad actors, bad policies, and bad regulations. We often pay attention to the policies like the Be Heard in the Workplace Act and the Equality Act and the Raise the Wage Act and everything else that's super important to our communities in terms of legislation, but there's so much being done on the regulatory side of things. And one of the cool wonky, again, the wonky thing, one of the cool wonky things is when these proposed rules come out, they're proposed. It means we can disrupt the process. And there are so many of us on this panel in the community who are coming up with really creative ways to do that, like NCAPIA, like NAPOF, like the National Low Income Housing Coalition, doing a plethora of things. So follow all of us. I think we should all drop our organization's social media handles because we're usually talking about these things on social media, and I'll do that too.
Great, thank you. Kudai or Suann?
I think I dropped in here all the HRC and the NCAPIA content on Equality Act. Feel free to reach out to me for more information on things that we can do. The anti-trans HUD bill, HUD rule the comment period is already closed, so the most we can hope for right now is that there's enough comments to tide us over for a while. And I think the last thing I would leave with is just to remember that womanhood looks so different for so many folks, and to just really keep that in mind whenever we're talking about womanhood and the relationship to womanhood, because there's so many different types of women out there. So yeah.
And I would say be in your authentic self, because at the end of the day, whatever's going on externally, you've got to understand what is your true north. So you're going to make decisions that impact whether it's yourself or your family or community. And I think there's going to be times where you're going to have to make difficult choices and decisions, especially with this pandemic and what's going on. So I would say, number one, make sure that you understand your authentic self. And number two, help somebody else, because my job is to uplift other women. My job is to support other women to do this type of amazing work and important work. And so I'm going to continue down that path of my purpose and the fact that I know what that is. So I encourage you, if you don't know, to find out. And if you need help, call me. And I'll drop my email as well into the chat.
Thank you so much, everyone. I feel like I could talk to you all forever. And as much as I am tired of Zoom calls, I felt a lot of energy and a lot of power in this digital space with you all. With that said, keep an eye on the chat for all of our social media and websites and things. I dropped Apollo's website in there. We have a community fund for our most impacted workers. So if you can and are able, please check that out. And I'm going to turn it back over to Madeline to close us out.
Thanks so much for moderating this discussion today, Alvina, and a big thank you to all of our panelists for joining us for such a dynamic conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time. Next week is our last week of the Legislative Leadership Series panels, so make sure to tune in for our panel on housing issues, home ownership, and access to capital for AAPIs on Tuesday, September 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And for our final session about exploring the diversity of the AAPI community on Thursday, October the 1st, also at 2 p.m. You can register for these remaining discussions on the APAC's website. We will culminate all of our Legislative Leadership Series panels with APAC's celebration, our virtual Asian prom. So register on the APAC's website for that. It will air October 1st at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, and you can RSVP at www.apacs.org. Thanks so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day.